Hello there and welcome to the third part of my SCP tier list. If you haven't watched the two previous parts, well, shame on you, I'm going to start right now. SCP-231 Special Personnel Requirements, or the Seven Brides of the Scarlet King, essentially. It's a very interesting one. A very gruesome one when we go off by the implications. Procedure 110 Montauk, very infamous for SCP-231. Very infamous within the community. I put it at A tier. It's a good concept. The execution is semi-good. The quality, it's a product of its time, but it kinda still holds up to this day. And SCP-231, without it, there wouldn't be a Scarlet King, and Scarlet King is one of those pieces of lore within the SCP lore that you just can't imagine without. So it definitely gets points for creating the Scarlet King. Next one. Dr. Spankle. This, I don't know what to say about this one. It's a bird which is intelligent and can talk and is very loud. As stated in previous videos, I don't really like SCPs which are intelligent, talkative animals. This one kinda saves itself because it has an additional anomalous property that it is very, very loud and it's very funny. Very funny interview logs, but that's essentially it. There's no bigger story connected to Dr. Spankle. It just exists and loves to exist. That's it. Next one. A malfunctioning destroyer. Definitely gets an A tier. I always love SCPs which are tied to real life events, and this story simply tells us that SCP-2399 is the cause of the red spot on Jupiter, and that it accidentally shot everything that it had at Jupiter instead of Earth, which it wanted to destroy. It's a well-written story, and I like the historical bits in there, and the real life events. Pretty good. 239. Very infamous SCP. Its writing it's bad. The writing is very bad. It gets a D tier for me. It doesn't even have the word reality bender within it. It's very, very weird that it doesn't even have that word in it, but okay. Supposedly, she was put into a coma and all that stuff. And all the stories related to her, tied to her incident 239-B, Clef Kondraki. It's very infamous, everybody knows about that one. But by herself, she doesn't have that much. Although I like how the SCP Foundation contains her, by simply telling her a lie and she believes it because she's just a 10-year-old girl. But definitely needs some fixing up and tidying up because for today's standards, it doesn't hold up anymore. Next one is Slot Unallocated. Now this one is a very unique one because the SCP Foundation themselves doesn't even know that this SCP exists, nor does the O5 Council know that it exists. It's basically contained by D-class personnel, and they have to keep the information about this SCP, when I remember correctly, out from escaping, and it's very gruesome, pretty, you feel sorry for those D-class, but at least they're doing their job. Very noble for them. Because of this interesting SCP format, the format screw, I give it an A tier. Scp-Rpg, it has to go to S tier. That somebody just made an entire RPG game just for this story to be told. It's such a great SCP. Such a good one. Next we have an unfinished ritual. It's just the Sarkic cults doing stuff and screwing around with lives and death and all that beautiful stuff. The story was kinda left open. I give it an E tier. I didn't really care for it all that much, and Sarkicism is one of those groups of interest which are just bloodthirsty rituals which want to destroy the world, essentially destroy human civilization and all that stuff, which I don't really care. There are way too many SCPs which are just deadly murder monsters or can destroy the world by simply existing. An unfinished ritual does get some points because it is tied to a group of interest and definitely adds to the lore of Sarcasm. It gets a D tier. It's not that bad compared to those guys here in E tier. Now, the one we should not talk about. The SCP by itself is fine. It really shines because of its very interesting yet very simple format screw. Everything is told in pictures through pictograms. So, but it isn't that much. It's not more, it's not less. It's just an entity which will get you when you tell information about it, which isn't like in pictograms or in pictures, illustrated, stuff like that. It gets a C tier. Not that impressive, though the art is pretty cool. SCP-2599, not good enough. I'd say she gets a C tier as well. Nice concept, executed fairly well, and you just feel sorry for her. You feel sorry for her. She can't do anything against it. She can't do anything against it. That's pretty sad. This SCP-2602, I believe it was called. I kind of forgot what this SCP actually did. It was, from what I can remember, it screwed with its own name and classification and how people refer to it. From what I can remember, everybody can only refer to this SCP as a normal library. It was definitely very interesting. It gets a C tier as well. It was mediocre. Nothing more, nothing less. A good format screw. And we can never have enough of those. The pan-dimensional vending machine. Now this one. That's a very interesting one. Very basic SCP, but it really shines because of its collaborative log. With all those items from another dimension. But by itself, it's okay. It's a vending machine which does stuff and just likes to exist. Why the hell not? Oh no. Cthulhu Ag Off. Good old Cthulhu. It's a good parody of Cthulhu. The first time I read it, it was pretty funny and very disturbing and gross and disgusting, but everything was put together so nicely. It definitely gets an A tier. I would love for the whole logs which detail the suffering of 2662 to be first and then tell us what SCP-2662's actual effects are, but you can't really do anything against that because that's how an SCP file is formatted. Special containment procedures, then description, then additional stuff. So you can't really blame it because of that one little quirk. The Blind Idiot. Now this one is very interesting indeed. It's very humorous. It wants to travel through other dimensions and explore everything that it can see, but it cannot comprehend the concept of flypaper and is constantly stuck there. It was very interesting, a very interesting read indeed. One of those humorous SCPs which you would just think, lol, okay, what an idiot you are, but you can't really blame it. It's from another higher dimension, and I don't know how to treat this one. It's a B tier, it's an A tier. It's one of those LOL Foundation SCPs, you can't say anything against that. Nice concept, executed fairly well. Teleforce. Now that's one of my favorite SCPs. It's essentially just a reverse Big Bang time bomb. And I like it how it ties with real life persons, Nikola Tesla, to point the main person out. It's a very interesting thought. A reverse time bomb, as previously stated, and I do love the concept of it. And the Fox file at the beginning, how you think it's not that much of a big threat, but then classified data, you learn how this SCP is very, very dangerous and is going to destroy us all. Another world-ending SCP, but this time it's executed way better than most of the Series 1 SCPs, which are essential, most of them are essentially murder monster SCPs. The story is left very open, and it kind of gets minus points for that, but the good points outweigh the bad points. It gets an S tier, one of my personal favorites. Another one of my personal favorites, 2718, What Happens After. It's such a cruel afterlife, such a horrific thought if this were to be true. In real life and within the SCP universe, just horrific fate. What can you do, and what can you do about it? You know that it exists, and you're already doomed because of it. There's nothing else to be said. If you know 2718, the format screw that it has, and how its actual file is structured, very unique SCP indeed. And answers what happens after we die. Eternal suffering, because why the hell not? Because that's what all SCPs are, just eternal suffering, which want to harm human life. SCP-2719, Inside. I don't care for it. It basically screws around with concepts of things, and I don't fully get it. I treat it as kind of a spell that it makes things become conceptually inside and outside and all that beautiful stuff, and you can only refer to it as inside or outside, or inside out, as was in the test with SCP-682, We Are to Destroy Reptile, because 682 just likes to counteract things, because it's the embodiment of blood armor. Anyway, 2719, it's an F tier. I don't fully get it, and the things that I understand, I simply don't care enough. The concept is interesting, the execution is interesting, but nah. SCP-2747. Now this one. It's a pataphysical SCP, basically breaks the fourth wall, not directly to us, but from the point of view of the SCP Foundation, which is definitely an interesting thought. Pataphysics, I love pataphysics. They just screw around with my mind, fourth wall breaks, very meta stuff, and as previously stated with the database, I simply adore meta stuff. Where is it? I adore meta stuff. It's it's less of an actual entity and more of a force of nature per se. I kinda interpret SCP-2747 as being some sort of a representation of a Scarlet King, because the number 7 does appear a lot within the file, but it isn't directly stated what SCP-2747 actually is. I kind of refer to it as more of a force of nature. And definitely a very interesting read, very destructive, and a very existential crisis for the SCP Foundation. And maybe to us if we are also fictional, but that's for 3812 to decide. And some people even say that SCP-2747 might be able to kill 3812. No, it's not. 2747 is still like infinite narratives below 3812. 3812 could easily just destroy 2747. So, anyway, A tier. Cousin Johnny, one of the most cruel, horrific, and most weirdest SCPs I've ever encountered. It gets a... I like how it ties to religion and all that beautiful stuff. It's a detail. It's one of those SCPs which exist to be cruel and torture humans, because like every SCP just hates humans because we are disgusting. I don't know why they just have to do it. It's like the hobby, it's like their job. They get paid for it, I don't know. Cousin Johnny gets a D tier. A torture SCP, very, very, very horrific. I don't have anything more to say about it. The town that got fucked by bears. Now, it's one of those humorous SCPs. You just read it and you think like, okay, well, that happened. And you get a slight chuckle out of it, but in the end it didn't really stuck with me personally. It gets an E tier for what it is, but for what it isn't much. I definitely laughed. It's a nice thought of just bears multiplying and appearing and fucking up an entire town. It's beautiful. Oh, Death. One of the best SCPs. Also written by DJ Cactus, and DJ Cactus really has a streak of writing S-tier SCPs like 1730 and 049. What other SCPs are from him? I don't know. 2935, one of the best SCPs, a good story, very confusing at first, but if you put the pieces together, you are likely going to get it. You will likely get it. How everything's just dead, a concept that is so foreign to me, how even immortal and indestructible SCPs like 963, but 963 and 682 are just dead within this alternative dimension. The origins of SCP-2935 are very mysterious, though there are some theories that it may be tied to the Brothers of Death, and as previously stated with SCP-1440. Though they are my favorite deities, or one of my favorite deities in SCP lore, and I kinda like that. And there are many tales which allude to the Brothers of Death being more powerful than the Scarlet King, and tales which say that SCP-682 is a child of a Scarlet King. So it definitely gets lore points for that, and just deserves S tier. It's a good story. The only things that I kinda dislike is that SCP-682 actually died, and this point is very often brought up in SCP power scaling debates that 2935 killed 682, meaning that 682 is not immortal per se. So that's kind of frustrating, and I kind of hate 2935 for that, but what can you do about it? It's still a good story, and doesn't detract from the actual file. The the coffee machine. One of those SCPs which you just want to have in real life. I mean, I wish that the log which details the many drinks would be a collaborative log would definitely put this SCP much higher, because collaborative log SCPs are most often pretty highly ranked because you can add your own stuff to it. I don't really care for it. It's one of the nicer SCPs you just want to obtain, want to have, but it's okay. It's alright. I don't have... okay. Just a chair. B or A tier. I put it in B tier. It's a kind of suspicious that at the beginning it's just described as a chair that makes people sit on it and they don't want to leave the chair. It's kind of suspicious, but then you get to the note from 05-6 with you being the new 05-6, and it's very chilling and a cool concept, fairly executed fairly well. One of those things that really stuck with me, because the concept behind this is very cool, the execution was very brilliant, the story behind it was also very good. It's a B tier though, because in the end, the story is very left open, and if everything's just showed to you and then nothing more is done with the actual SCP itself. The story is left open for room for interpretation, room for tales, but the actual file doesn't really expand on it. Now this one. A very cute SCP. I'll give it an E tier. I do love this infinite long puppy from what I can recall. It's a long puppy with real humanoid entities just using it as a means of transportation, and the dog is indestructible and immortal and just chills there and having the best time of his life. It's such a beautiful image that this infinite pup just stretching around and around and just vibing underground. Hey, right. One of those weird SCPs, and it's a good change, but it's a little bit too weird. Then again, I have put other SCPs which are way more weirder than this SCP on a higher list, higher tier. I usually don't like dog SCPs. They often tend to be on the cuter side, and just reading about cute dog SCPs just gets a little bit boring after some time. And the actual concept itself, I don't really find that interesting. It's an E tier. Now this one. Well, we never get to actually know about what the conflict is that is detailed within SCP-2998. It's presumably Armageddon, the war between Satan and God, from what we can tell, but it isn't for certain. And it's such a beautiful SCP, such beautiful imagery, such a good story, and because of that, it should get to an A tier. But what really, for what SCP-2998 gets bonus points for, is how SCP-055 and SCP-579 are utilized. Well, they only appear briefly in that SCP file, but it's a classic combination between those two SCPs, 055 and 579. Those two, when you think about 055 or 579, you just have to think about their counterpart. And this SCP utilizes this combination of those two SCPs fairly well. It's a classic combination. SCP-3000 Ananta Shesha. A big serpentine-like eel who is actually a god, or maybe not a god, just vibes there underground, and it gets an B tier because we finally get to know out of what amnestics are made out of, and they are made out of this weird black eel juice. It's a very horrific kind of. It screws with your mind, and I always loved psychological horror more than physical horror, because while physical horror may last a little bit longer, psychological horror, you can't really fix psychological horror, or in general psychological damage. So this SCP really executed this psychological horror aspect fairly well. I am content to move it a tier higher, but why don't I move it to A tier? Let me think. Well, it gets an A tier. It's not worthy enough to be stuck at B tier. It definitely deserves an A tier. Red Reality, I read it. I loved it. The story is so well put together. You can tell the inner conflict, the sadness, the fear of Dr. Robert Scranton. You sympathize with him, you feel sad about him. And the recordings feel very natural, not like forced, like, hey, this SCP is very sad, now cry. It's a subtle horror, psychological horror, slowly descending into madness. And it's so well written, it definitely deserves an S tier. One of the saddest SCP, and not this goddamn paper dragon dimension. It's 3001, the saddest SCP in my opinion. You just feel sorry about Dr. Robert Scranton, and then the tale Until Death, which basically explains that he escaped the Red Reality SCP-3001, but then became the Old Man. Does make sense, and that's my personal headcanon from now on, after I read the tale and 3001 itself. And also definitely a nice concept, like a space between dimensions and universes, which shouldn't really exist, but somehow he got trapped in there. Poor Dr. Robert Scranton, poor Dr. Anna Lang. The end of history. Now that's an interesting one. Alien hive mind society living on another planet, far more advanced than us humans could ever be. It's your classic extraterrestrial horror story with hive minds and, of course, insects. I put it at an A because it's fairly well written. No details are left out, you get everything explained, and the story is pretty nice. Oh, at the same time, it's just another murder monster society, which we kind of have enough of those already. But it's a good one. It's a very good one. World of Two Artists. I like the imagery, I like the concept, but the story is left very open. But at the same time not. It basically details the conflict between the Church of a Broken God and Sarkicism, Yoldaboff and McCain. And the images are very beautiful, beautifully painted, beautifully drawn. So it definitely gets points for its self-made artwork. But the actual SCP itself and the conflict between Yoldaboff and McCain are kind of unrelated. I don't know what this SCP actually has in common with the conflict between Flesh and Machine. I actually F tier. I was very disappointed when I read the entire file and watched some videos on it, and it was simply a very open story, and the story itself and the actual SCP itself didn't really connect with each other, in my opinion. Oh, no, that's a classic one. The amount of stories that you can write about SCP-3008 are nearly endless. I get it because it's endless. I put it in S tier. If there's nothing left out. It's such a nice and beautiful story. It's so sad that the one who wrote the journal made it out, but then got offed by one of those instances because he just stopped running when he was out the door. I would keep running, but that's just me. It's an S tier. It's definitely an S tier worthy SCP. And it's pretty funny thought. I have nothing to say about it. 3004, one of those scary SCPs, but for me it wasn't that scary. The audio contained within the file is definitely quite unnerving. And the implications that children are trapped inside there, it's just horrific, but then again, it's one of those scary SCPs and it didn't scare me personally. It was unnerving, but I could still sleep well after I read the file. It's an E tier. It doesn't get FT because it was very unnerving. And the audio logs are a pretty nice touch. The Doorman, a classic SCP, a classic one. Everybody knows the good old Doorman. I'll put him at V tier. I like the concept of a Doorman. I like his abilities. I like the implications that he is actually very, very smart, as he acquired a generator, cadavers, chemicals, and a coffee creamer from what I can remember, and even some SCP objects. And he's basically just chilling somewhere in a foundation site and preparing for something. The story is left very open, as are most SCP Series 1 SCP's stories. So it kind of gets minus points for that, because for today's standards you have to have a full story, not just a quarter of a story, which SCP-303's file essentially is. But for what it is, it's a good one. And very horrific, not horrific, but kind of unnerving imagery, but at the same time he doesn't actually do anything. It just vibes that he just stands there and enjoys his lifetime that he has and does weird things, but we don't know what he actually does. The Escapee 3125. As previously stated, I'm a sucker for fifism. It definitely gets minus points because it's just another nightmare deity which wants to destroy us all, but it definitely gets points because it's related to fifism, one of my favorite groups of interest, because it's so abstract, absurd, and cosmic horror-ish. Gets an A tier. I like the concept. I love the fifism god, the big omniversal starfish which just wants to rule everything by collapsing every dimension and layer into one, and it being the most powerful being in this region. It's so cool. It's definitely a good one. The imagery, what it actually does, that the human mind is not able to comprehend what it actually is, and then we just die. Kind of like 055 anti-memetic, but 3125 isn't really anti-memetic, and it kills you. And it kills you. Or maybe 055 kills people too, but we simply cannot know about it. Well, with this SCP, it gets an S tier. I like how the beginning, how you actually access its description. It's so unique from all other SCPs or SCP objects. You have to give out a code which is 5 times the 5. And then the chamber, which basically protects you from SCP-3125, and nowhere else can you survive with having knowledge about SCP-3125. It's a very chilling story, and you just know that Foundation is doomed by simply reading the first paragraphs. It's most definitely going to win this battle. Or fifism. The Recorded Man gets an 8. It's for Series 1 SCP is such a nice concept. It's so executed so beautifully. When I first read it, I was just not astounded, but very impressed for how high quality it actually was. From what I can remember, it's been a while. 315 gets an 8 here. Humans Refuted. S tier. First of all, the image it's very disturbing how real it looks, and it definitely adds to the file. And then the actual creatures themselves, how they just maintain their species by having an almost indestructible egg always inside themselves, and newborns also have an egg inside themselves, and those inside the egg also have an egg inside themselves. It's kind of like an infinite loop of eggs and maintaining the species. It definitely gets an S. Carl, fuck off. Or fuck off, Carl. One of those joke SCPs. You can't really say anything about it. But personally, I didn't find it funny. Humor is something for everybody, and humor can mean something completely different for many people. For me, it wasn't funny. It really didn't do it for me. Why not F tier? I kind of feel sorry for this guy. But at the same time, I don't care. 3-1, the child of man. Dr. Bright's sister, one of Adam Bright's daughters, children. It definitely gets point for being a Bright family member, but in the end, nothing much is done with her. But I like the story of Adam Bright, how he just rose up the ranks to finally free his own daughter from imprisonment, but then failing and most likely having been assassinated by the other O5 council members. It's pretty sad how cruel the Foundation is just because something is anomalous. I mean, what can you obtain from 321? How is this anomaly going to benefit you in any sort of way? It gets an E tier. It gets a D tier because of the accompanying story with Adam Bright and how he tries to save his daughter. But for today's standards, the writing is okayish. Definitely below average. 3300, The Rain. I love isolated horror stories. It gets an 8 tier. It's such a weird horror story, SCP. So abstract that you cannot even fully comprehend what's going on. You just feel sorry for those individuals trapped within their town where the enormous rangers reigns and messes up with their lives. 3301, The Foundation. This could actually be made into an actual board game, because this SCP is a board game created by Dr. One Entertainment, my favorite group of interest. And the amount of things that you can actually do to it, when I can recall correctly, there was a collaborative log accompanying this SCP, and collaborative logs are always welcome. The amount of stuff that you can do with this SCP, the concept, the work that has been put into this SCP, and how it could actually be made into an actual board game. It's so cool. I want it as an actual board game, but at the same time, it's a little bit impractical because enormous things and stuff. But with a little bit of editing, it could be made true. When we fade away, SCP-3309, it's an S tier. It's basically a meta view on the deletion system of the SCP wiki. When an SCP article gets -10 downvotes, then it's most likely going to be deleted, with the author having a brief chance to rewrite the SCP or before it ultimately gets deleted. And for us, it's such a mundane task, but now we are talking about the concept of narratives, and from the point of view of the SCP Foundation's narratives were greatly affected by this. Entire sites, SCP's personnel, chunks of time just get deleted, with us not even fully realizing what kind of chaos we're actually doing to the SCP narrative, the SCP universe. And it's definitely a very good story, a very meta story, and I always love me some meta stuff. SCP-3333 Tower. Skin Stealers, it's as simple as that. It's as simple as that. I like its simplicity, I like the general concept of it. A little bit horror-ish, but I am kind of enough by Skin Stealers, it gets to see you. For your eyes only. It's such a good format screw, it's such a simple format screw. Simply put the special containment procedures at the end of everything. And then it is revealed that we, the reader, are the actual anomaly. It's so good. It's so great. One of the best ones. It gets a B tier. Actually, I like how it breaks the fourth wall, kind of. An A tier. Now, I will only cover the next 5 SCPs. Then I will end the video. 342, A Ticket to Ride. One of the early SCPs, one of those horror monster SCPs, but it's such a good story. It's such a weird imagery. It's so horrific. It's so, I don't know how to describe it. It does achieve its goal of horrifying the reader very perfectly. And you just feel sorry for individuals trapped or who have boarded a vehicle with SCP-342. You just feel sorry about them. SCP-343 got an F tier. The concept is cool, but the execution simply lacks in every single corner of 343's existence. And more could have been done with this SCP, like interview logs or something. It just says what this SCP actually does, and a little story accompanying this SCP, but it lacks in so many areas. It's one of the earliest SCPs, and you can definitely tell by how it is written, how it is structured. And my personal belief is that SCP-343 isn't even the real God, only just a reality bender who pretends to be God, because he failed to erase data on some Foundation doctor who tried to uncover the truth that he isn't actually God, which he most likely is not. It's an F tier. It doesn't do it for me. One of the wholesome SCPs from A Gift from Dad. SCPs for people who have daddy issues. Isn't that beautiful? It's very wholesome. I remember a paragraph which generally made me tear up. Not because I have daddy issues or something, but because it was very wholesome and very sad at the same time, because this SCP gives you a message, gives the person who eats the soup a message of their father who has either passed away or isn't simply there anymore. And it's a very wholesome SCP. It's a good one. Definitely struck me in the feels with some paragraphs, because some were genuinely pretty sad, but at the same time very wholesome. Very wholesome indeed. The red pool, or how I like to call it, the blood pond. Come on. Red pools sound so dull. Blood pond is the way to go. It's a good one. It's one of those murder monster SCPs which spawns murder monster SCPs. The exploration log, it's very mysterious, its origins, but I ultimately didn't feel satisfied with the exploration log. There were too many data expunged in that one, especially at the end bit there. I like how the SCP Foundation contains it, but it's an E tier for me. Oh god. Oh, one of those humorous SCPs. This guy is some form of god, and you have to you have to convince him that you are also a god, and he simply does not understand humanity and how humanity works, and you could simply throw on a light switch and then he would consider yourself a god. It's a pretty funny story. It generally made me laugh the entire time. It's an A tier. It's a good A tier. Living Legos. I mean, it's one of those SCP objects that are objects and which can do stuff. It's as simple as that. But I love the concept of it. The execution is fairly simple and well put together. One of those harmless SCPs. At least it doesn't kill you or something. It even starts to stop firing when they are built into war machines or something. When they are around humans, and they only start doing stuff when they only start doing harmful stuff when humans are not around. So it gets a D tier because it isn't bloodthirsty. Now the last one for today. The Pattern Screamer. I love pattern screamers. I love this non-existent thing that somehow still exists. I like the cross-test with SCP-6A2. It's such a classic one. And this file definitely struck me. This file definitely is very memorable. And one of the best pattern screamer SCPs. It's so mysterious. It pulls off this mysterious vibe and at the same time an ominous vibe so well. It's a good one. It's a good SCP. Only a few more to go. I'll do one more. SCP-3999, I am at the center of everything that happens to me. Meta stuff always gets into A tier, into S tier. It's just beautiful. It's from the SCP Foundation's perspective, Dr. James Teleran was tortured by some malicious nightmare entity, but from an outside view it was actually just a horror writer not able to decide what he should do for a story with Dr. Teleran and just wrote a bunch of horror stories and ultimately scrapped them. That's why the file for SCP-3999 is so all over the place, because in actuality it's just some horror writer who couldn't decide what to do with Dr. Teleran, constantly writing horror stories but ultimately scrapping them. It's an S tier. It's definitely an S because of a very nonsensical format screw, the nonsensical tests which become kind of unnerving, kind of funny and hilarious. You just feel stories for Dr. James Teleran. And the meta stuff, as previously stated, I am a sucker for that. Meta stuff is always welcome. So this is going to be the end of part 3 of my SCP tier list. Have a nice day wherever you are. Goodbye.